In this lecture, we will give an introduction to programming languages. Let's say I enter some letter on my keyboard. Last time we talked about input devices, so if I type something there, it gets brought into the computer and it can do some stuff with it. So a question that we might want to ask is, what actually gets stored? So if I type the letter A, for example, does A actually get stored, or is it something else? Even better yet, even when I do store something in there, how does the computer actually understand what it is that I'm asking it to do? I mean, last time I checked, I can't just type in something or tell the computer to do something and it necessarily does it right away. It has to be able to interpret it and do something with it. So how do we actually communicate with the computer is probably the big question we should be asking. But before we answer that question, we need to understand that there are two types of signals out there. There are analog signals and digital signals. So analog signals, we can think of them as this continuous waveform, and they're used to represent different things. So sound is one such example of an analog signal. Now, digital signals, they represent information with a sequence of zeros and ones. So here, 0 would represent low voltage, and 1 would represent high voltage. So a computer would use digital signals. I mean, it doesn't make sense that we use analog signals. So when we type in that A, we send a sequence of low and high voltages that represent the zeros and ones that let the computer understand that we're talking about the letter A. Now, the language of a computer is what we call the machine language. And this language consists of a sequence of zeros and ones. So that's how our machine actually understands us. It understands us by reading these zeros and ones. So when we type in something, it gets translated into the machine language, and then our computer would read that language. So the digit itself, the 0 and the 1, we can call this a binary digit or a bit. Now, these sequences of zeros and ones, we refer to them as binary code or binary numbers. And we can take these sequences and just kind of keep combining them. So a sequence of 8 bits would be called a byte. And then we can take sequence of bytes and combine them into larger types of bytes. So we have different terms for depending on different sizes. So 1 byte would be considered 8 bits. Now a kilobyte, which is 1024 bytes, would be 2 power 10 bytes. And we can kind of just keep going. We have different terms for these different sizes. So a megabyte would be 1024 kilobytes, or 2 power 20 bytes. A gigabyte would be 1024 megabytes, and it would be about 2 power 30 bytes. And then a terabyte would be 1024 gigabytes, which would be 2 power 40 bytes. A petabyte would be 1024 terabytes, which would be 2 power 50 bytes. And an exabyte would be 1024 petabytes and 2 power 60 bytes. And I might be thinking, well, why is it 1024? Why isn't it not just 1000? Wouldn't that be easier to remember? And no, yeah, it would be easier to remember, but we gotta remember, since we're dealing with binary numbers, we're storing powers of 2, and 1000 is not a power of 2, but 1024 is. So this means that every single letter, number, special character, so like asterisks or dollar signs, doesn't matter what it is, every single one of these symbols is encoded as a sequence of bits. Now, there is a very commonly used encoding scheme that takes 7 bits of our binary numbers, and this is called the American Standard Code for Information Interchange. But it's also known as ASCII. So, I mean, everyone calls it ASCII. No one really remembers the actual name for it, but we have these ASCII codes. So this consists of 128 characters. So they go from 0 to 127. So let's take our A example from earlier. So if we were to store A in our memory, it would actually be stored as 10000001, but the ASCII equivalent of that is actually 65. So another example would be the number 3. It's actually stored as a character, even though it's a number, but the binary representation of that would be 0110011, the ASCII equivalent of it would be 51. So every character in a computer would be represented as a byte. And remember, a byte is 8 bits. So these 8 bits would be used to represent every single character that we would need for communication purposes. But you might be thinking about, wait a minute, a byte is 8 bits, but ASCII uses 7 bits. So in order for this to work, an additional 0 would need to be added to the very far left of our binary number. So if we go back to our A example, we would just tack on a 0 right in front of the first one. Now there is a second encoding scheme that we can use. In fact, it's becoming more and more popular, and this is called Unicode. What makes Unicode different from ASCII is that Unicode consists of 65,536 different characters, which is a big jump from ASCII, which only consists of 128 characters. And the reason why Unicode can get away with this is because we use 2 bytes instead of 1 to store a Unicode character. Now, Java, which is the programming language that we're going to be using in this class, uses the Unicode encoding scheme. So that means that every character in Java is represented as a sequence of 16 bits. Now you might be asking yourself, well, wait a minute, I have the Unicode encoding scheme and I have ASCII, and what happens to those first 128 characters, and how does that get integrated in Unicode? Well, what's really convenient about Unicode is that those first 128 characters are actually the same as ASCII. So we can think of ASCII and Unicode as the same thing for at least the first 128 characters. Now, it's worth noting that ASCII is very useful if we're dealing with only English. I mean, pretty much every single character or symbol that you can think of that you're going to use in normal English is covered by ASCII. So yes, your entire language is basically just 128 characters. But if we're dealing with larger types of alphabets, so if we're dealing with international languages, then Unicode is going to be a lot better for us. In fact, it's the only option since we can't store international languages in ASCII.